customer asked me if we can make this any quieter, but I think with as big of a cam as this thing has, this is about it. You can feel how aggressive this idle is. And when I say feel, I mean the whole vehicle oscillates. And you can hear it too, even though he's got a pretty conservative muffler on it. Today we're in a late model JK with a cammed LS 6.2. I think it's an LS3. You guys know how I feel about cammed engines. There's no doubt this thing has got good mid-range and better top-end power, but that's at the cost of bottom-end drivability. Before the LTs, the 6.2 LS was pretty much the standard for the performance LS engine. It was over 400 horsepower. With an LS3, you could easily push 450 horsepower with perfect drivability, idle at 500 RPM, etc. If you wanted more power than that, you could punch it out to a 7-liter, you could put a supercharger on it, intake and all that other stuff, headers. This is a perfect example of somebody taking a 6.2 and pimping it out so that it puts out more horsepower. There are some trade-offs with the cammed engine. Here I am cruising along the highway with traffic, and it's relatively nice, but you can definitely feel that cam. You can hear that cam. If I wanted to accelerate, it's just a little more dramatic than a non-cammed engine that would be a little more docile. One of the reasons cammed engines run rough is late intake valve closing. Back in the days of the 70s and the emission cams, where they closed the intake valve at or before bottom dead center, what they were doing is trying to keep any of the air fuel charge blowing back into the intake manifold. So basically when the piston comes down and it sucks the air charge in, air fuel charge in, you want to close it right when the piston hits bottom dead center, so that when the piston starts coming back up, it doesn't push that back up into the intake. And that's exactly what a big cam does. And the reason they do that is that column of air going into the engine at high RPM continues to go in. Remember, air is elastic. So the intake valve can close several degrees past bottom dead center. And what you want to do is shut that valve just as that column of air stalls. And that's why you're getting the maximum air fuel charge into the cylinder, and you definitely get more horsepower. In fact, you can exceed 100% volumetric efficiency, meaning that if your engine is X liters, you can force more liters than that into the engine using this ram effect. The downside is when the cam is at lower RPM, it does force that air fuel charge back up into the chamber, and then you end up getting lower intake manifold vacuum and that rump. Now, over the years, there's been solutions for it with separate ram pipes, and fuel injection helped a lot. If this was a carbureted engine with this cam, it'd be even rougher. One of the other advantages that we have today is the roller cams. Not only roller cams, but roller lifters. Back in the day when we had flat tappet cams, we had to restrict the ramps. If the ramps were too steep, it could flatten the cam, and flat cams were actually a reality back then. By going to a roller lifter, we can accelerate the lifter faster, get more area under the curve. So the opening and closing ramps were steeper. And it's just incredible if you think today, this engine here is definitely putting out well past 450 horsepower. And that was about what an LS6 454 Chevelle was rated at back in 1970 with high compression, flat tappet cam, over 11:1 compression ratio. So we're putting out the same horsepower or more with a smaller displacement engine and all of its technology. I don't know what's in this engine. I don't know what compression ratio or internals this guy has. Really, he didn't have a whole lot of problem with drivability. A lot of guys like that rump, and it's tough. You know, I just went through a drive-through and set alarms off. So if that's what you like, this is definitely a good thing. Now, if you don't like the rump muscle car feel, then don't get a cam. Just get a more powerful engine. And there's a lot of options out there now. Obviously, going to a larger displacement. If we took this exact same cam and put it in a 7-liter engine or a larger engine, it would feel more mild. You could go to an LT engine, which has all of its technology. Of course, you can go to a supercharger. I just drove an LT4 to Utah and back, and it was like driving a stock vehicle. You wouldn't know that that thing had a supercharger on it. It idled at 500 RPM. On the highway, you could barely hear the engine. So there's definitely other options if you don't want to go to the big cam. But this is how we made horsepower in my day. Camshafts, intake, headers, and all that. Is there anything wrong with it? No, absolutely not. Is there compromises? Yes, but what you consider a compromise might be a benefit or an advantage for somebody else. Having that rumpity-rump idle might be what the guy is looking for. And I will say, when I get into one of my old muscle cars, like one of my 69 Z28s or my LS6 Chevelle, I kind of like that sound and that feeling. But those are about 50-year-old cars, and back then that's what we did. Today you can go to GM and buy a LT5, ZL1, whatever, with close to 800 horsepower. You can idle it through a drive-thru and not tip anybody off. You're not driving a Toyota Camry. In the early days, most of these engines had manual transmissions for obvious reasons. The automatics didn't like the big cams. And back then the transmissions were inefficient. They didn't shift that well. They ran hot. And we're going to talk about that. So the transmission of choice was the manual transmission. You had full control with the clutch. And if you knew how to drive a clutch, it was kind of an art. You could get really good 0 to 60 times. If you didn't know how to drive a clutch, then the automatic would be better for you. Today with launch control and all the technology we have, it's really hard to beat an automatic, especially when you got 8 or 10 forward gears. You're just always on the pipe. Back in the day when we only had 3 or 4 forward gears, we had to have long leg, meaning that the engine had to pull longer in each gear. Today you drive a 10-speed LT and it's like want, and it's always right there in the power band. And you got to remember, horsepower and torque are two different things. We've talked about that many times. Is it right for you? Well, you have to make that decision. So to wrap things up in the camshaft, it really comes down to what do you want? My opinion is, in a Jeep that you're going to take off-road and crawl at low speed, the camshaft is probably not the best option. You want the best drivability and throttle control that you can get. However, if you're mainly on the highway, which I suspect this Jeep is, and you want better highway performance, and you're not really too concerned about crawling off-road, then the camshaft is a viable option to get more horsepower. Another thing to consider is if you put a big cam in, you got to make sure the rest of the components are up to it. That means you have to have an intake and exhaust that's going to flow enough air. You have to have a custom tune. The engine's probably going to run a little bit hotter because we're raising cylinder pressure. So you might have to beef up your cooling system. I get the question all the time about headers. Do I want to go to headers? And again, it just depends. I know that some of the major players, even, I don't know if it was Motor Trend or Hot Rod Garage, did some test on headers and showed that there wasn't that much of a gain on the LT engines with headers. However, if you have a stock engine and you put a header on, you're not going to see the same gain that if you have a really radical 12-to-1 built engine that has to breathe. So you have to take everything in its context. My opinion is the stock manifolds flow really well, and they're good for about 500 horsepower. I wouldn't waste my time with shorty headers. I don't think they do much, if anything, above stock. The mid-length headers, I think, can give you some advantage, but obviously the full-length headers are going to give you the most advantage. Full-length headers are expensive. They can be a pain to fit, but I've driven 5.3s that have been tuned and cammed, and I was really impressed how much power they put out. But here's the thing. If you got a cammed 5.3 with a high flow intake and headers and exhaust and all that, you're putting out 400 horsepower. You could have just bought a 6.2, stuffed it in there, kept it stock, and had 400 horsepower. Back in the early 1980s, I worked with Christopher Jacobs, as a lot of you know, and we had a 1981 Camaro that was pushing 4,000 pounds, and Chris entered that vehicle in the NHRA bracket racing class, 11-second class in a 4,000 pound Camaro. We had slicks on it, and it was basically a 350 engine that had a roller cam, which back then was somewhat exotic. And Chris, he was like Doc Brown. He had every computer you could imagine hooked up to this thing. We had full control of the fuel mixture. We were using the Holley Dial-A-Jet. We had added NOx sensors to the engine. Now remember, this is the early 1980s, guys. This technology was brand new. The Buick Grand Nationals ran the NOx sensors. Of course, we had ported heads, and the camshaft was all roller rockers. And we got that Camaro to run reliably in the 11s, which was very impressive. In fact, we would drive that vehicle to the track with slicks in the back seat, and then we'd install the slicks when we got to the track. Most of the other competitors against us were driving fiberglass body tube chassis things. Camaro, if you guys are interested, go back and look up the Doctor's Guide to Engine Performance that was published back in the 1980s. It has that car in it. I remember Chris being on the line eating a Big Mac while he was next to a fiberglass bodied tubular chassis Mustang, and he beat the guy. And he did it all through technology. So what it was basically a look at what the future was going to bring. What Chris was doing with mixture control, spark control, all the friction reducing technology, not only the roller stuff, but Chris was an AMSOIL dealer back in California, and we did the coast down tests where we would change things like engine oil, transmission fluid, spindle bearing grease, and axle oil, and we could actually see the reduced friction, and you'd be surprised how much we picked up over the conventional oils back then. Chris also had an additional fuel tank in the trunk with race gas, and we ran a Holley pump. Chris developed the Nitrous Safety Kit, which monitored fuel pressure, oil pressure, all sorts of things. So when you hit nitrous, because with nitrous basically you're putting liquid oxygen into the chamber, and after it burns all fuel, it's going to burn something else, a valve, a piston, whatever. This technology allowed him to basically just floor it. And I remember times when the system shut down because fuel pressure went low or whatever. But it was all automated, so basically Chris programmed in what he wanted to run, and in bracket racing, that was all about. Is he set a time, and then you try to meet that time, and with all this technology helping him. So that's what we did, and Chris ended up tying first place in his bracket. I don't think the NHRA had the heart to give it to him in a stock-bodied Camaro, so they tied him with somebody else. But what Chris had proven is you could take a stock Jeep that you could idle through a drive-through and still perform up there with high-end engines. And that's exactly what the LT is doing right now, and it's doing it through the similar technology that Chris was doing, and that was try to control everything. Try to control spark, try to control fuel, try to control friction, get as efficient of a combustion chamber as you can get. So we're gonna hit the mountain with this cammed LSJK, and stay tuned, got a lot of really, really interesting stuff coming up. Thanks.